You may have heard the saying before that Jesus is the answer. Well, okay, but if Jesus is the answer, what exactly is the question? Fortunately, we don't have to look far. The question to which Jesus responds comes out of the story of God and the people of Israel. Recall that God's people, Israel, have turned away from the covenant pact that they made with God. So the question naturally arises, will God continue to be faithful? Will God stay true to that initial unconditional promise God made to Israel's ancestor Abraham so that God's people experience life and not death? Or, as we looked at this question last time as it's put to the prophet Ezekiel, can these dry bones of Israel live? In Jesus, the response to these questions is yes. God will be faithful in a life-giving way for not only Israel, but for all people. In this session, we'll look at the life and person of Jesus. In 4 ways, we'll ask, who was Jesus and why is he important? In the next session, we'll consider Jesus' death and resurrection. But first, how is it that we know anything about Jesus? What we know about Jesus comes to us from a few different historical sources, but most of that is from the New Testament. The New Testament is the second and smaller part of the Christian Bible. Like the Old Testament, it's a collection of writings, like a little library, and this part of the Bible contains stories of Jesus' life called Gospels, as well as letters, exhortations, and other forms of literature. The Gospels are the first 4 books of the New Testament. They look at aspects of Jesus' life, focusing on his birth, ministry, death, and resurrection. Each gospel is a remembrance of who Jesus was and what he did, and each is distinct in the way that it retells the meaning of his life for different communities with different needs. The Gospels aren't histories in the modern sense of giving an exact ordering of the chronology and details of Jesus' ministry. Remember that history didn't quite work this way in antiquity. But they can be understood as generally reliable depictions of Jesus' life and character. Their main goal, however, is to tell us about what Israel's God has done through Jesus here in this world and why that's good news for all people. So, who is Jesus? The first thing to say is that Jesus is Jewish. He is from Israel. As a side note, the Israelites started to be called Jews toward the end of the Old Testament period. The signs of Jesus' Jewish identity are made clear to us right from the beginning of the New Testament. The first book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, begins with a genealogy of Jesus that includes figures like King David and Abraham. And in a countercultural move at the time, Jesus' genealogy also includes outsiders like the Canaanite woman Rahab and the Moabite Ruth. What Matthew is saying to us, loud and clear, is that Jesus is both born into Israel, he is Jewish, and also the way that he comes to us, as we'll see more clearly here and in the sessions ahead, begins to break down the barriers that divide us. Jesus is born into Israel's story in a special way. Following this genealogy, we see that Jesus is given the name Emmanuel, meaning God with us. Jesus enters into the life of the Jewish people as one of them, in flesh and blood. But his presence in Israel is also God's very own presence, God's way of entering once again into Israel's story. Matthew draws another parallel between the life of Jesus and the Old Testament people Israel. Jesus, although just an infant, is perceived as a threat to the political powers of his time. For their safety, his parents take Jesus to Egypt and return to Israel years later under divine protection and raise him in the town of Nazareth. In this way, Matthew is showing how the Old Testament story of Israel going down to Egypt and being led out from there under God's care is being replayed, only this time with a focus on one individual Israelite, Jesus. The Gospels include several other parallels between Jesus and Israel's leaders, like Moses. The identification of Jesus with biblical Israel is not arbitrary. Jesus arrives on the scene as both Israel, summing up in himself Israel as a people and their story, and as the presence of God among us, This is important, for it means that the great question that sums up the Old Testament story, will God remain faithful to God's people despite their wavering faith, or can the dry bones of Israel live, is a question that's now put to Jesus. By locating Jesus inside Israel's story and claiming that he is the embodied presence of God with us, we look at him. We look at who Jesus is and what Jesus does in order to see how God's unconditional promise to bless the world comes to fruition. Second, Jesus is a prophet. A prophet in the Bible has a specific role. The main thing a prophet does is not predict the future, but rather to speak on behalf of God in the present, to share God's concern for justice and the well-being of the poor here and now. Jesus was a prophet in the tradition of the Old Testament in this way. He came to proclaim a new way of being in the world, a new form of community. Jesus called this God's coming rule, or the kingdom of God. What Jesus meant by the kingdom of God is not easy to define. But what's clear is that what he means by it is manifest in Jesus himself, in his life and ministry. The kingdom of God is present in Jesus and where Jesus is. Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God in many ways, such as this: the greatest in the kingdom of God, the one who receives most in this new order, is neither the wealthiest, nor the most powerful, nor the most able or influential. In the economy of God's kingdom, the notable person, the greatest, the special one, is the one who demonstrates care and concern, the one who makes solidarity with the poor, the one who both receives and loves the most. Christ models this in the way that he lives for others, the way that he combines love with justice, and the way that he befriends the marginalized. Here's a summary description of Jesus' kingdom that I find helpful. The kingdom of God is a new community, a new way of life marked by love, justice, and mercy. In it, sins are freely forgiven, and those who are in bondage find freedom, and the needs of the poor are met. It's all of these things and more, because these things express who Jesus Christ is and all that he means for us. Jesus enters into Israel's story as a prophet to proclaim God's kingdom, and the kingdom he proclaims is something that he's bringing about through his very own life. Third, Jesus is a teacher. It might surprise to hear that little of what Jesus says is actually new. Most of Jesus' teaching is rooted in the Old Testament. At one point, Jesus even says, "I haven't come to end the law or the prophets, but rather what I've come to do is fulfill them." Jesus fulfills the teaching of the law. But how so? One way of seeing this is that Jesus gathers the entire law that God gives to Israel and interprets it through two simple commands, one from the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the other from Leviticus 19. Love God wholeheartedly and love your neighbor as yourself. This point comes to its clearest expression in Jesus' radical teaching that we are called to love not only the lovable, but to love one's enemy as well, or to love those with whom we strongly disagree, such as those that we believe hold a political position that harms more than it helps. Jesus isn't saying to overlook the wrongs of others, not at all, nor does this mean that Christians are called to be in relationship with everyone. That requires wisdom and discernment. When Jesus says to pray for one's enemy, it means something more like holding out hope in ourselves and before God that no one is outside of the reach of God's reconciling love. This teaching, taking a posture of loving the unlovable, is bound not only to impact others, but to change us as well, to shape us into a new kind of people. And finally, Jesus heals. We live in a world marred by sickness and death. If God's kingdom is really good news, then it must relate to us as we are, as embodied persons. In the end, it must address and overcome even the forces of death. The healings of Jesus are relevant here. Jesus heals sickness and disease. He heals by speaking, and he heals by making skin-to-skin contact with people whose illnesses have made them societal outcasts, people who may not have known the comfort of human touch for a long time. In one case, Jesus even heals a paralyzed man on account of the faith of his friends who had brought him before Jesus, but not before forgiving the sins of the paralyzed man. Now, I can't unpack that quickly, but what's clear is Jesus' healings show us that he is concerned with the fullness of life. He declares God's kingdom. He gives hope. He addresses our relation to God, neighbor, and enemy, and he heals. Through Jesus, God tends to all of our life, and that includes tending to us as people with flesh, skin, emotions, and desires. God tends to us as embodied persons. So, who is Jesus? Jesus is Jewish and Israelite. He is a prophet, a teacher, and a healer who calls us into a new way of life. I like the way that theologian Sean Copeland puts it when she says that Jesus calls us not simply to a new set of teachings, but to follow him into the way that he is. Jesus is a person, and what he invites us into, Christian discipleship, is a new form of relationship with God and others. In your groups, take time as we pause in the larger Christian story to reflect on who Jesus is. Consider that when God enters fully into the story of Israel, and with Israel into the human story, God does so in this way, in this person. If when we look at Jesus we see Emmanuel, God with us, or the very face of God, then what does Jesus tell us about what God is like? For it is this God who comes and acts in Israel's story, and as we'll see, who opens up this story so that it has significance for all people. Take time to reflect on what God must be like if God is revealed to us in, through, and as Jesus. So here we've looked at who Jesus is and the new life that he calls us to. In the next session, we'll look at how Jesus not only calls us into new life, but actually makes new life possible for us. In other words, we'll look at how Jesus himself is the answer to the great question that God poses to Israel. Can these dry bones live?